Presenting now is Seyi Ajibade. He is a scholar-musician whose research explores African art music, institutional practice, music and community, and compositional processes within Africa and the diaspora. After completing his undergraduate studies at the University of Lagos in Nigeria, he continued his musical and academic training in the United States. He holds an MA in ethnomusicology from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree in general education and piano performance from Carthage College in Wisconsin. As a pianist, Ajibade has received awards for excellence in solo piano competitions. As an emerging scholar, he has presented his research at meetings of organizations including the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Canadian Association of African Studies. Beyond academia, he is deeply committed to musical community building and arts advocacy. He volunteers with the non-profit organization Àkójọpọ and is the founder and executive director of the Chamber Music Society of Nigeria, an initiative dedicated to advancing classical music practice, cultural exchange, and community engagement in Nigeria. He will be presenting Mediation as Cultural Logic for African Art Music, Insights from Àkójọpọ's African Art.
Finally, I get to be the last person to call Professor Agau's name, because my work actually builds on one of his articles. Kofi Agau recounts a story about a book launch in his article, The Challenges of African Art Music. The story concerns an anthology titled Piano Music of Africa and the African Diaspora, edited by Ghanaian pianist and scholar William Chapman Yaro. In the article, Agau highlights the politics of recognition and the challenges many African composers face in publishing their works, some of which stems from the ambiguity surrounding African arts music identity, a condition that associates with the politics of representation among ethnomusicologists. It raises issues that echoes the broader discourse on the complexities of African art music and its positioning within musicological and ethnomusicological studies over the past 40 years. African art music has sparked sustained discussion and dialogues at conferences and symposiums like this concerning its practice, defining factor, compositional and performance styles, colonial legacies, tonal influences, the navigation of multiple cultural studies, question of authenticity, and the negotiation of identity, all of which remain central to the challenges confronting African art music. Although I would love to engage with all of these narratives, but instead, I will focus on the contribution of existing practitioners, musicians, and composers whose projects, such as concerts, compositions, and scholarship, have continued to develop or perhaps complicate debate on African art music. In order to make my argument, I will specifically examine the work of Àkójọpọ, a non-profit organization where I also belong as a scholar and also as an art administrator. Àkójọpọ, meaning harmony in English, is a 501c3 non-profit art organization officially registered in Nigeria and the United States. Since its inception in 2019, Àkójọpọ approaches African art music from a practical point of view through curation of educational and artistic initiatives. These initiatives include virtual mentorship, concert initiatives, music publishing, art administration, and music education hubs. Against the backdrop of the challenges facing African art music, as Agau has described in his articles, Àkójọpọ serves as a platform for cultivating experimental pathway through which the challenges of African art music may be addressed, negotiated, or reimagined. I will only be focusing on the concert initiatives. The concert initiative serves as site for research inquiries and organizational ethnography. Àkójọpọ staged its first concert initiative, Orin-Ajo, in 2021, and the second, Orin Tuntun, in 2022, in Lagos, Nigeria. I'm just going to play video from this concert so you can have a glimpse of what the concert felt like. Also, let me know if you can hear, please. The submission for this concert reaffirmed the complexity identity of African art music. We, myself and other parts of the concert committee, observed the complex epistemological and etymological understanding of African art music. Let's not make a sudden conclusion just yet. A more complex concern for me is the 2023 African Art Music Commissioning Project, which I used to develop my topic on mediation as cultural logic for African art music, insight from Àkójọpọ's African Art Music Commissioning Project. Before then, I would like to present a framework that I used that guides this work. Although this research primarily used two conceptual framework, however, I built this presentation on the British anthropologist and musicologist Georgina Bond, whose concept of mediation clarifies how music acquires meaning, not only through its sonic form, but also through the social and institutional practices that shapes its production. Mediation is a pivot for rethinking production and meaning. Bond helps us to understand mediation not as a neutral conduit, but as a productive force that shapes how music is created, performed, interpreted, and negotiated. In my research on African Art Music Commissioning Project, mediation is enacted in decision-making through process such as rehearsal, musician selection, programming, institutional partnership, and music selection. The African Art Music Commissioning Project, also titled Oritutu but 2.0. On January 2nd, 2023, Àkójọpọ concert team officially announced its African Art Music Commissioning Project call for composition. This open call resulted in 52 submissions from across borders, including submissions from Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and South America. Although the aim of the project is to engage Afrocentric art music, but the call welcomed diverse compositional styles with emphasis of musical notation as a legitimate format for submission. The selection committee comprises of 3 Africanist composers and research from Nigeria and Uganda. Their long-term engagement in African art music includes composition, commission projects, awards, fellowships, and research both in Africa and internationally. The committee selected composers from Brazil, Ghana, Mexico, Nigeria, South Korea, and United States. The committee claimed that they favored composers who, among the 52 composers, they favored these composers who adopted extended techniques in their composition, claiming that these techniques have been underexplored and they intend to explore these techniques throughout the project. My aim simply is to stimulate debate on the cultural and epistemic process through which African art music is produced, negotiated, and mediated by offering a critique on prevailing discourse on African art music. A question that drives me is to ask, how is Àkójọpọ institutional involvement through the African Art Music Commissioning Project contributes to reframing of African art music? This process will aid the resolution of ongoing discourses and questions like who writes about African art music, how, why, to whose authority do composers engage it, what ethical considerations are determined, and how are negotiations made. Mediation, the first kind of mediation I'm exploring today, mediation as a logic in the production phases. Mediation is effective and used to theorize each production phase, conveying ideas from the production inception to its end. Mediation espouses the shifting power structure and influence between the diverse groups of composers engaging an Afrocentric world. So the first mediation is selection as a form of mediation. The 2023 African Art Music Commissioning Project was executed through strategic selection to guide programming and organizational decision. The selection process draws on Akinyuba's first notion on the categories of composing African art music, while the first one which states music using African themes in Western idioms and instrumentation, while the other two are discussed in my future conversations as I move on. The abilities of these composers to command Western musical idioms played a role in their expression of African art music sonic nuances. I will get into this later. While scholars may argue that these choices of engaging non-Africanist composer may negatively implicate the authentic notion of African art music or alter the project's Afrocentric aim, but let's ask, African art music in itself requires a bicultural approach. Seminar and intercultural dialogue as a knowledge transmission. The review committee created a pedagogical space that allowed commissioned composers who are non-Africanist and Africanist, a mixture, to gain knowledge through presentations between review committee and commissioned composer. This seminar paved way for cross-cultural dialogue among composers, allowing them to dissect, analyze, and transmit knowledge. This knowledge served as basis for commissioned composer to engage and understand African way of thinking. Identity negotiation and composition. For some composers of African roots like Genevieve Aloite Papo, who was born in Ghana, raised in Lagos, studied music in Ghana, and later migrated to the United States, a process of identity negotiation and artistic engagement is shaped by multiple cultural and geographical experiences. Unlike another composer, Jonathan Carrasco, who is a Mexican composer, holds a master's degree in education technology, has interest in electronic music, theater and acousmatic music, electroacoustic music. Aloite Papo's involvement in this project can be positioned as an Afropolitan contribution, emphasizing what Animal Apegon Ajapong, note as Afropolitan project, strategies through which artists and audiences approach Africa as a point of connection while locating themselves in global modernity. While I consider Carrasco's involvement as a Pan-African engagement, I don't intend to get into this today. Aloite Papo's composition, Echo Dance, which I'll play for you, is a minimalist dance piece based on bell pattern common in West African traditional music. She explored common African musical elements such as repetition, rhythmic variation, and color response. Echo dance evokes a strong, ubiquitous bell pattern that recurs and is distributed across different instruments. The percussive nature, including suggestion for hand clapping, creates a drive for more dances, especially in sections where the string players adopt extended drum technique by tapping the instrument at the end of the bow. According to Aloite Papo, Echo dance is a deliberate choice of honor to Lagos, which means Echo means Lagos, where she began her musical studies at a young age. Her participation enriches Àkójọpọ's mediational practices, situated within a diasporic lens, that is the enablement and engagement with African art music by African musicians in diasporic spaces. Let me play you what Echo dance sounds like. For Jonathan Carrasco, the Mexican, his composition incantation explored varieties of ideas that emphasized skill and artistic virtuosity. I'll also play you what it sounds like. Audience perception and the cultural politics of African art music. Audience perception and the cultural politics of African art music. The audience participation of this concert is both minimal and active, in which their embodied responses, active required gestures, and listening process mediate their experiences during the African Art Music Commissioning project. From my conversation with some of the audience members, who are not all active listeners of African art music, expressed an anticipation of a traditional form of African music. The audiences were predominantly Nigerian, who picked interest in the concert based on their relationship with performers or just a regular concert attendee. Other audience include scholars and musicians who are active practitioners of art music. After the concert, one of the audience, who is a musician and composer, claimed that some of the music to me seems serious. It seems to be too academic, but they are great composition and sounds fascinating. But this does not sound this does not really sound like African music. Some of the comments I gathered are aspects of the withdrawal from the use of excessive technical nuances, which has auditorily shifted from their sense of imagined African art music, or even African music broadly. My reflection on postmodern, post-concert interviews reviewed a series of responses that highlight the intersection of aesthetic judgment and cultural knowledge, as well audiences' inability to have preconceived African listening practice. Although they got Afrocentric cues, but they encountered more consents. Finale, what I termed finale. The intercultural and transnational approach recognized that such interaction among diverse composers can lead to a new musical expressions, combining multi-dimensional forms of engagement of African art music. Perhaps animate what Agau termed in his keynote as edginess. The institutional approach explored by Àkójọpọ further illuminates the sustenance and engagement of Afrocentric production and reframes the presentation of African art music towards a transnational lens. Although my presentation shows the continuum of African art music and perhaps African music, it does not imply that the authority to define, preserve, or promote African music belongs primarily to non-African musicians, scholars, or institutions. In fact, that would be a failure. Instead, it awakens the sleeping agency, or for the better use of word, the potential agencies that should be taken seriously, that have been dormant in our institutions and also among scholars, composers, and African musicologists. Àkójọpọ's effort and model and expanding African music across diverse cultural spaces and regions produce potential reimagination or reframing of African art music through the lens of post-colonial modernism. My recommendation, which is my final note. Instead of depending on the audience or entertaining a utopian fantasy of instantaneous transformation, the mediational form of practice will serve as a method of knowledge production and deconstruction of conceived primitive notion of Africa, rather than overburdening the concept of decolonization or reducing it to a catch-all interpretative framework. The concept of mediation will direct analytical attention to the networks of relationships through which music acquire meaning and social discourse in Africa. As Agaru states, decolonization harbors too much unproductive imprecision to serve as a meaningful guide to charting progressive futures for creators, exponents, and scholars of African music. This creative and cultural logic, through transnational and creative collaborative engagement and intercultural practice, might create a developed representation of African art music in a changing global order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seyi Ajibade. We're gonna go for questions now. Are there any questions? Sunday's hand is up here, so we'll start here before we go to the room.
Okay. Thank you very much, Seyi. That's very interesting presentation. And also kudos to the Àkójọpọ for the good work. But there's something you said that kind of caught my attention and also got me worried. Is the fact that you have to teach the composers how to think like an African. I mean, I just paraphrased it. You said it very beautifully than what I said, you know. Well, so I'm worried because then the question that was running through my mind, a lot of questions, by the way, is that, oh, are they not Africans, first of all, before submitting their compositions or before even curating their names for the competition? Or, and then more importantly, what I was also thinking about is that what are the African criteria that makes a particular music criteria? I mean, that is also kind of counterpoint to what Dr. Adakwe was talking about, that the way. And so if I bring Paolo Ferrari to this, it sounds to me as a kind of pedagogy of the oppressed. And so we are trying to decolonize, and the process itself is colonizing the compositional thought of the composers. So it got me, well, how does your mediation, kind of, come into that play?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I didn't say the Africans. They are mostly non-Africans. So they are composers from they are diverse composers from different part of the world. They are from Brazil, Ghana. So that was why there was a section for actually, like you said, helping them to think like African. And also the project was more of a kind of experimental project to help people see what composers can do, and of course they own their composition, they own the rights to write, and they wrote their composition. However, there was need for guidance, there was need for that transmission of knowledge to happen. I don't know if I respond to you all your questions.
I mean, yeah, that's good. Just a follow
Okay.
up. Don't you think that itself is problematic to tailor guide composers on how to, bring forth their creativity?
Well, critically, I think I don't think it is problematic. I think if we as Africans are to learn how to write like Mozart, I remember doing all those figured bass and all of those things. I don't see why non-Africans cannot learn about Africa.
All right, I think there's another hand up here. Alaba, yes, please.
I just want to offer a comment on the question about Àkójọpọ training people to think like Africans. I think that is problematic, and that is not precisely what Àkójọpọ was trying to do. That wasn't the aim. For a little bit of context, in 2022, when Àkójọpọ requested for African art music compositions, we realized through the compositions that we received that there is this assumption that you have to be African to be able to write African art music. And there's another assumption that whatever an African writes is African art music, as long as it is written in the art music idiom. And we came to that conclusion that that is very reductive. And that perhaps the way forward might be to even invite non-Africans to write in this broadly defined African art music tradition. So what we did with the seminar itself, that Dr. Ronalty was part of it, Dr. Luanga, and sorry, I forgot his name from Uganda as well. Yeah. So what they did was to share or sort of sensitize the participants to works by African composers, who have written in this idiom of African art music, one. And also they shared their own works of how they sort of navigate, this musical tradition. And the whole point at the end of the day was to experiment what it might mean to write African art music, what it might mean to define African art music. We were not specifically looking for specific materials. We were instead interested in people who would use indigenous African musical materials, without telling them this is what you have to do, this is how it has to be done, but letting these people experiment and building on the framework that Akinyuba proposed, that African art music, should borrow from and use African indigenous musical materials. Sorry, I'm not the presenter, and I feel bad for taking this much time to answer this. But yeah, I just wanted to offer that clarification because I think it's very important. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, okay, other questions?
Thank you. Maybe we go to the room to see if there are questions in the room. All right, as a way to close this, maybe I just ask you to as a way to ask this question, I remember a conversation with Professor Mojola where he made a very striking comment, and that comment is that the post-colonial subject would always have a battle within the inner self and the outer self. And that comment in and of itself seems to be a summary of the provocations that are going on in your conversation as mediating between what constitutes African art music and what constitutes the other components that sort of at the periphery of that conversation. So my question would be that in what Àkójọpọ is doing and in your research of what Àkójọpọ has been doing in the last couple of years, what do you find that either reinforces some of the stereotypes of Africanity, or what do you find that dismantles some of those stereotypes so that there is a spectrum? And I'm getting at this because so that we find a spectrum of what happens in practice, away from the philosophizing of scholars and all the things that we write. In practice now, bringing together these people, what do you find that either reinforces some of the stereotypes of Africanity or Africanness, or dismantles such stereotypes within the works that you've analyzed?
Well, I think before the 2023 project, I would say there's some stereotypes of African art music from, at least from my Nigerian point of view, that there is a simple chord structure. It just goes simple, and there's also it has to be pleasing to the ear kind of thing. And some are also dependent on this drumistic idea that it has to be drumistic and it has to be so. And I'm sure works like, what I found on the 2023 project is that there's a shift in my own thinking, and I think these composers who are actually non-Africans and also some Africans, let's say schooled composers, were able to help me reimagine compositional styles that brings in different tools, non-fixated kind of approach towards their own composition. So especially the compositional extended techniques, for example, and also shifting from tonal to even thinking about bitonals, or even thinking about outside of the tonal centers, not thinking strictly about tones. There are sometimes I feel like there's still some issues with those things sometimes, because it depends on how it is being used, really. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Final question from you, maybe we just 1 minute or so, if you can.
Okay, very quickly, I think my question is surrounded about like this idea of writing what African music is, or like writing African music. Don't you also think that maybe it becomes problematic when there is, or there has never been a specific categorization of music styles in African music? And this is what I mean. If I tell you to write in like Western music style, it's problematic if I state it broadly like that. But when I say impressionism, you know what to expect. And I can rightly also say people need to be trained or need to be like guided through that process. It doesn't sound problematic because it's different movements. But from what you said, when you said, the extended techniques and all of that, I am thinking more like that sounded more like a new music movement to me. So don't you think maybe it's more problematic? The problem was coming from the fact that it is very difficult to categorize like different movements, and people need to be guided about what is expected, which I don't think is problematic in itself. But just because stating African music is very broad, unlike if I state Western music and I said writing, in the Baroque style, that's not problematic. You know what I'm expecting, but you can't say such for African music too. And there needs to be like a session like that. I'm just thinking maybe that would know all this, problematization comes from that. Thank you.
I don't know if you asked a question, but or you suggesting something.
Maybe a little bit of both. Maybe you actually thought about the idea of like if African music has this categorization of different movements, it becomes easy to tell people what to compose in the style they want them to compose in. Just like Alaba said, I played in 2022 Àkójọpọ's concert, and most of the composition I played, I can rightly tell you if I wasn't told like it's African music, I'll have said European music because of the way they sound. That's because there was no strict guidance of what to be expected. I would just say that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's usually that problem, and maybe composers are becoming more aware of different ways. I don't know if there is what's it called, grouping, or there is a nomenclature, or there's a grouping that this is this kind of African art music. There is a composer that wrote his music, and it was jazz-like. But then I remember that even Akinyuba has a jazz waltz, which I think Professor Agawu analyzed in his whose Discolonization is this. So I think it all depends on different ideas. And for me, sometimes I'm still thinking about all of these things because it continues to develop over time. So sometimes I don't even have an answer to the questions.
All right, thank you very much. I think on that note, we'll return to the room for the closing of the sessions. Thank you to all the presenters for such insightful sessions. A round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much.